He did not discuss grabbing or scratching Gabby's face, which is an offensive act, and the officers did not ask him about it. Brian claimed that he felt the need to lock her van and keep the keys because his big fear was being left on his own because I don't really have a phone. So if she goes off without me, I'm on my own. Which, it was a lie. Man. When asked about his demeanor, Brian explained that seeing the police lights turn on made his heart rate go up. He and Officer Robbins then joked about how Officer Robbins also feels the same way when he sees police lights turn on. Officer Robbins then asked Brian if Gabby takes any medication, to which Brian said she's crazy, then laughed and said, "No, I don't think so. None that I know of." While Officer Robbins and Ranger Krell spoke with Brian, Officer Pratt began speaking with another park ranger who arrived on the scene, Melissa Holes. Ranger Holes asked Officer Pratt if he was worried about Gabby's story. Tellingly, despite the information he had received about Brian's controlling behavior of locking Gabby out of the van without her phone or laptop, and her explaining that both she and Brian had serious anxiety, Officer Pratt responded, "She has a lot of anxiety, and from what she's claiming, she's the full-on aggressor here." Officer Pratt then went to his car and called the second witness to get his version of the events. The witness explained that although he had maybe seen Brian push or shove Gabby, he did not observe a full-on punch to the face or anything. He explained that it appeared as if Brian was trying to close up the van and left a backpack on the back of the van. Brian then climbed into the van, blocking Gabby from getting in. She began hitting Brian with an open hand while telling Brian to let her get into the van before she eventually was able to climb over Brian into the van. The witness then prepared a written statement. "I observed a man and woman appear to have some sort of dispute. They were talking aggressively at each other and something seemed off. At one point, they were sort of fighting over a phone. I think the male took the female's phone. It appeared that he didn't want her in the white van. He got into the driver's seat and she followed him. At one point, she was punching him in the arm and or face and trying to get into the van. She actually climbed in over him and over to the passenger seat. I heard her say, 'Why do you have to be so mean?' From my point of view, something definitely didn't seem right. Something definitely didn't seem right. It was as if the guy was trying to leave her and maybe take her phone." Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins then spoke. Officer Pratt summarized the information he has learned, admitting that he had not really questioned Brian yet, but nonetheless incorrectly concluded that Gabby was the primary aggressor. Utah law requires officers to determine the predominant aggressor. Utah law also provides that the relevant inquiry focuses on 1. The existence of prior domestic violence complaints, 2. The relative seriousness of injuries, 3. The likelihood of future injury to each party, and 4. Whether a party acted in self-defense. Under those factors, Brian was the predominant aggressor. He repeatedly explained that his injuries were baby injuries. It is not a big deal, the most serious of which were the result of Gabby and Brian struggling over her phone, not the result of intentional harm by Gabby. Gabby's injuries, on the other hand, were the result of Brian grabbing Gabby's face with great force and cutting her cheek. A threat assessment would have revealed that Brian's violently grabbing Gabby's face is a well-recognized red flag for potential serious violence. Finally, although Brian claimed to act in self-defense, a proper evaluation of Brian's actions that led to violence would have accounted for Brian's use of non-defensive force when cutting Gabby's face, and it would have led to a determination that Gabby was also acting in self-defense once Brian took the controlling actions of taking Gabby's phone, locking her out of her van and away from her laptop, and telling her to walk away. Officer Pratt explained what, in his view, was the problem with Gabby being the primary aggressor. In instances of domestic assault, be it a male or be it a female, we shall arrest. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily have to go to jail. We can do a citation, but if it meets one of three criterion. Which one of them is that we can assure that they're not going to further risk each other's safety, but the problem with that is that they live in the same vehicle. Officer Pratt reiterated that in his view, Brian was the victim. Wow. But he concluded, fortunately for her, just because he's bigger and stronger, we can't treat this differently than if it was a male on female violence, and we're going to have to charge her. And we can do a citation if there's some arrangement that can be made to separate them. And then we have to let them know that there's a no contact order in effect, and we have to let him know that the only way to drop it is to go to the police department during business hours and fill out a waiver. Of course, this did not happen. Officer Pratt informed Brian that the state legislature had taken away the officer's discretion about what to do when confronted with domestic violence. He told Brian that he had determined Gabby was the primary aggressor and Brian was the victim of a domestic assault, at which Brian laughed. Officer Pratt clearly understood that the law required the officers to arrest or issue a citation in this situation, and that Utah law imposes an automatic no contact order that places a legal barrier to abusive couples being in contact with each other. One of the things that the state legislature doesn't give us discretion on is charges when it comes to domestic assault. So at this point, you're the victim of domestic assault, and even if you didn't want to pursue this, we don't have a choice. He also explained automatically right now there's something called a no contact order in place from this point forward until tomorrow. If you wish to drop it, you have to go to the Moab police station and fill out a waiver that you're requesting a waiving of the no contact order. Officer Pratt asked Brian if he had any ideas on how they could avoid having Gabby spend the night in jail but be separated from Brian so that the officers can simply issue a citation. Brian asked the officers if he could spend the night in jail instead. Officer Pratt said he couldn't because Brian wasn't being charged with anything. Officer Robbins told him, "You haven't done anything wrong." Brian responds by joking with Officer Robbins about taking Officer Robbins' radio to jail with him, and both officers laughed. Eventually, the officers arranged through a local domestic violence organization for Brian to have a place to stay the night, allowing Gabby and Brian to separate for the night. This is crazy. Officer Pratt then spoke to Gabby to explain that she was responsible for what had happened. He said, "You're dealing with some struggles emotionally and mentally at your age, and hopefully it works itself out. But the stuff you did today that contributed to this, because you both contributed to this, is as a result of your inability to cope with anxiety and stress you're having." This is wild. Wow. So in a way, you're kind of a victim of this. I think you would have done better if you had the skills to do better, but you don't learn skills until you learn skills. He then told Gabby, "Based on what you've said and based on what our witnesses have said, and even based on what your fiance has mentioned, trying his very hardest not to have you in any trouble, he does have marks on him that witnesses say were caused by you slapping him, and that even you say you were slapping him and aggressing him first. And I don't have anyone saying that he punched you aggressively. It sounds like it was shoving in a manner that was more consistent with trying to prevent you from entering the van or to get space from you, not to assail you." Like, are you serious? Officer Pratt's explanation to Gabby did not account for the scratches on Gabby's face or the fact that Brian was acting aggressively toward Gabby simply by locking her out of her van and taking her phone. Officer Pratt continued, "If the tables were turned and he was beating on you and you were shoving him, of course we're going to look at it like, oh, of course she's defending herself to get away from this guy, but we're kind of looking at it the same way with him, and we have to treat both fair, even if he's a bigger male and you're a smaller female. The law doesn't say, hey, Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins, you could treat people differently based on gender. We can't, even if it makes no sense, because you probably could not physically destroy this man the way he could if he attacked you. We can't treat you differently." Page 18. Despite acknowledging that the situation makes no sense, given the physical mismatch between Brian and Gabby, the officers disregarded and failed to investigate Brian's controlling and abusive actions that led to the confrontation, instead focusing solely on Gabby's admission that she hit Brian before he hit her. But according to both Brian and Gabby's accounts, that was not the beginning of the aggression that led to the physical fight. Officer Pratt then repeated the speech he'd given to Brian about how the officers had no discretion when addressing domestic violence situations, explaining in the legislature in Utah, they've made a law that when we have a domestic assault, they don't trust the police to make good decisions because too many cops have made bad decisions. So they say, we're not going to give you discretion. We're going to write a law that says if you have a domestic assault, whether it's male or female, male on female or female on male, whoever the primary aggressor is has to be charged. No choice. You don't get to give them a warning. It doesn't even matter if they're barely hurt at all and the guy doesn't want to press charges or the girl doesn't want to press charges. We don't have a choice. We literally have no choice. Gabby began to sob, begging for the officers to issue a citation for hitting the curb instead, saying, I don't want to be separated, and explaining that being separate from Brian would cause serious anxiety because she and Brian were a team. Officer Pratt told Gabby he would call the supervisor to see if there was a way around applying the Utah's legislative mandate regarding domestic violence. Gabby then called her parents. On that call, Gabby's parents demanded that Gabby fly home to get away from Brian, offering to pay for her ride to Salt Lake City and her flight home. But upon learning that the police were involved, Gabby's parents accepted Gabby's assurances that she should continue her trip. Gabby's parents relied to their detriment on the police officers involved to evaluate the situation and intervene as necessary to protect Gabby. But for the officers' failure to investigate and follow the Utah law, Gabby's parents would have intervened to end the trip and bring Gabby home. Officer Pratt called the Assistant Chief of Police, Brandon Palmer, and explained the incident. His description minimized Brian's controlling behavior of locking Gabby out of her van and away from her laptop and entirely omits crucial details about Brian's confiscating Gabby's cell phone and grabbing her face so forcefully that he cut her cheek. He also emphasized Gabby's anxiety without acknowledging Brian's reported anxiety, thereby presenting the situation as a one-sided assault instigated by Gabby as a result of her emotional or mental health breakdown. Officer Pratt then asked Assistant Chief Palmer if there was any way around the domestic assault statute. Assistant Chief Palmer said the only way not to comply with the statute was if the statute did not apply. Officer Pratt reread the statute, searching for a loophole that would allow him to ignore his non-discretionary responsibilities under Utah law. After briefly reading the statute, Officer Pratt spoke to Officer Robbins, providing a chilling description of the exact situation Gabby was experiencing, but that the officers' sloppy investigation had failed to identify. You know why the domestic assault code is there? It's there to protect people. The reason they don't give us discretion on these things is because too many times women who are at risk want to go back to their abuser. They just wanted him to stop and they don't want to be separated. They don't want him charged. They don't want him to go to jail. And then they end up getting worse and worse treatment. And then they end up getting killed. Officer Pratt articulated his clear understanding of the foreseeability. What? Hold on, I gotta zoom in. Officer Pratt articulated his clear understanding Officer Pratt articulated his clear understanding of the foreseeability of a victim being killed if police did not follow the statute. He then proceeded to intentionally manipulate the investigation to find a loophole to avoid following the law, and as a result, Gabby was killed. Officer Pratt reviewed Utah Code 75-5-102 describing assault under Utah law. In his words, the statute provides an assault is an attempt with unlawful force or violence to do bodily injury to another. That incomplete reading of the statute led Officer Pratt to conclude incorrectly that the question was whether Gabby had the necessary intent to cause Brian bodily injury. But the statute goes on to define assault alternatively to include circumstances where the individual commits an act with unlawful force or violence that causes bodily injury. In other words, under Utah law, intent to cause bodily harm is not required to satisfy the definition of assault. Officer Pratt explained to Officer Robbins that the question was whether it was her intention to do him bodily injury. We don't care what the result was. We care about the intent. He then instructed Officer Robbins that if you go ask her, what was your intention when you were slapping him? And she says, I wanted him to hurt or be ill or impair his physical condition, then there's nothing we can do. One way to word it might be, hey, When you slapped him, were you intending to cause physical pain or impairment of his physical condition? What was your intention? Is that what you were attempting to do? Whatever she answers to that question will seal her fate. Officer Pratt and Robbins then spoke with Gabby. Officer Pratt coached her to give the answer he believed he needed to exercise discretion and decline to enforce Utah law relating to domestic violence. Officer Pratt said, Gabby, this is a very, very important question. How you answer this question is going to determine what happens next, but the only person who can answer this question is you. Think very hard before you answer the question. Do not quickly answer it. Think very hard. When you slapped him those times, were you attempting to cause him physical pain or physical impairment? Was that what you were attempting to do to him? Gabby responded, no. Exactly as Officer Pratt hoped she would. She explained that she was trying to get Brian to stop telling her to calm down. Officer Pratt turned to Officer Robbins while still in front of Gabby and said, it doesn't sound like to me she attempted to injure him. It's your call. This is 100% your call. I support you either way. The officers then moved away from Gabby, where Officer Robbins explained his concerns to Officer Pratt. Officer Robbins said, I can't say I entirely believe her. Officer Pratt responded, I'm recording in society, the judges, and everyone can judge me for this. I'm looking at a 110-pound female and her fiance who have no means to be separated. He doesn't want to pursue it. She's not a threat to him, more than slight abrasions on her from her fingernails. I don't care if we use the actual letter of the law to not charge, but I also don't care because it literally doesn't possibly make sense to go full on domestic assault and do the whole thing. This is your opportunity to make a decision. Despite Officer Pratt's prior articulation of the law and the foreseeability of a victim being killed as a result of an officer's failure to follow the law, he continued to push to find a loophole, stating that he didn't care if they followed the law. Again, despite knowing that Brian had used physical violence against Gabby in a way that was not defensive, when he grabbed her face so forcefully that he cut her cheek, and that he had escalated tensions that led to 911 call by taking Gabby's phone and locking her out of the van and away from her laptop. Officer Pratt's observation that Gabby posed no physical threat to Brian should have caused him and Officer Robbins to reconsider their simplistic determination that Gabby was the primary aggressor. Instead, Officer Robbins responded, let's do this. Taking your advice, let me do a crime report on this. We won't charge her right now, won't cite her for it right now. I'll send it off to the city attorney, let them screen it, and make a decision. Despite Officer Pratt's prior assurance that he would support Officer Robbins' decision, Officer Pratt pressed Officer Robbins to reconsider, saying, if you send it to the city attorney and they strongly disagree with your decision and they throw a complete fit, you might hear about it in a very negative way, so I would make the decision yourself. Officer Pratt continued to manipulate the investigation and Officer Robbins towards a particular while attempting to avoid responsibility for actually making the decision. Ranger Holes observed, I'd rather be dinged for a decision I made than a decision I didn't make, Officer Pratt added, especially if they think you were completely negligent in your decision. Why give it to them? But Officer Pratt reiterated that he supported Officer Robbins in whatever decision he would make, including if he decided to send Gabby to jail. At that point, Officer Pratt received a call about another incident requiring police attention. Officer Pratt asked Officer Robbins, you got this? Officer Robbins responded, I'm making this decision. I'm going to cite them. I'm going to go follow through the procedure. Officer Pratt interrupted, okay, would you feel more comfortable handling the other call? Officer Robbins grimaced and said yes, because it seemed like a headache no matter what he decided about how to address Brian and Gabby's circumstances. Officer Pratt continued to manipulate the situation, pushing for a different outcome, searching for a loophole, allowing the officers to abdicate the role that the Utah legislature assigned them when they encounter domestic violence. He said, look, another option is to not charge them but separate them for the night. If they find themselves together again, what is it to you? You separate them, you provided for their safety. If he doesn't have enough sense to stay away and you got them separated, it's on him. Officer Robbins, nodding along with Officer Pratt, explained his intentional plan to avoid the statute's requirements and their duty to protect Gabby. After manipulating the investigation and pushing Officer Robbins toward his desired outcome, Officer Pratt then left to handle some other call, attempting to avoid responsibility for the ultimate decision. Officer Robbins spoke to Brian to gather information, including his driver's license and phone number. When Officer Robbins asked for Brian's phone number, Brian reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone, despite previously telling officers he didn't have a phone. Even though Brian pulled his phone out of his pocket in front of Officer Robbins did not follow up on Brian's claim that he didn't have a phone. Nor did Officer Robbins probe Brian's claim that he had taken Gabby's phone, which had contributed to tensions escalating into physical violence based on the self-evidently false reason that Brian feared being left without a phone. Officer Robbins told Gabby, "This is what I'm going to do. I've decided I'm not going to cite you for domestic violence battery, okay? It was only going to be a Class B misdemeanor. However, the domestic violence portion of it enhances it and makes life a major pain in the butt. So I'm choosing not to cite you today, so you're not going to be charged with anything, all right? But this is what I have to do. I'm separating the two of you tonight, okay? I want you guys both to be tonight away from each other, relax, and breathe." When Officer Robbins asked Gabby if there was anything she'd like him to tell Brian, she asked Officer Robbins to remind him to get a phone charger. Once again, even when directly confronted with information about Brian's having a phone, Officer Robbins failed to follow up on why Brian had claimed he didn't have a phone, which Brian claimed was the reason why he felt it necessary to confiscate Gabby's phone. After instructing Brian and Gabby not to contact each other for the night, Officer Robbins drove Brian to a motel and let Gabby leave in her van.